multifaceted. It comes in so many different guises. It's domestic, it's international, it happens in a variety of locations. But terrorism has been part of your life, basically, terrorism around the world. Does anybody know where the word terrorism was first used, or when it was first used? Which historical period in the world when what we recognize as terrorism was first used? It's hidden in your textbook. Anyway, I read the textbook, I'm not kidding. The French Revolution in 1789. You've heard of the French Revolution, right? They chopped off the heads of the king and queen. But that's when it was first used, terrorism, 1789. And the thing to remember is terrorism can come from the top, it can come from the government against the people, and it can come from the bottom, the people against the government. Again, we're looking at the multifaceted type of phenomenon. Nowadays, you don't hear about terrorist groups as much. If I were to ask you to name some famous terrorist groups in the modern era, which ones would you name?
ISIS.
Okay, ISIS would be right there. Al-Qaeda. What does ISIS stand for?
Islamic State of Syria, Iraq.
Nicely done. So ISIS, of course, ISIS at its peak was the best financed terrorist group in history. Basically, they were in charge of a piece of property in the Middle East bigger than England, and it had oil reserves they were selling. They were selling a lot of the looted antiquities. They were doing really well. That is until the United States and its allies put them out of business. One of the things that if you study terrorism, you find that the biggest, the Achilles heel of a terrorist group is having a, what? Why do you lock this door? Hello. So, the biggest Achilles heel of a terrorist group is having an organization. When there's an organization, there's leaders you can go after. As you can see with Hamas and Hezbollah, if you've been following any of the news recently, they've been killing one leader after another. And so what works best quite often is something called a lone wolf or leaderless jihad, not having a leader, having a very flexible organization, even though it's really not an organization. Terrorism is being continuously evolving. We can find examples of terrorism in biblical times, when the Romans were in Judea, and they were basically the Jewish zealots were a terrorist group back then, thousands of years ago against the Romans. We can find groups of Christian terrorist groups. We can find early Islamic terrorist groups like the Saxons. The word Saxon comes from hashishin. The notion was that a lot of them were hopped up on hash while they were committing their terrorist acts. But the bottom line is it's not new. It's just complete. It's always evolving. You don't hear about Al-Qaeda that much either. So one of the things that binds them together is religious or political views. So one of the things that you want to remember is terrorist groups are ideologically motivated. So while it might seem like they're participating in organized crime is basically financially oriented, not ideologically oriented. If you're going to talk to someone in the mafia, what's your ideology? Get money. So that's quite different than, dealing with, a religious jihad or something like that. And in the United States, we have right-wing terrorist groups, I mean, I really wouldn't call them, I would say extremist groups, because most right-wing groups are more bark than bite, you know, the Proud Boys and all of them. And the same thing with the left-wing extremist groups when you compare terrorism around the world. But violence is at the root of a lot of this extremism. So defining terrorism, I've always said I know it when I see it. Of course, that doesn't quite work in an academic situation, but it depends on your point of view. There's this one expression: one person's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. And so a number of years ago, I was a fellow at a counterterrorism workshop in Israel. And they took this, and they basically said that a terrorist is never a freedom fighter. It's a false equivalency. Because what does terrorism imply? Targeting basically innocent people. Okay? And so you can never be considered a freedom fighter. So of course, when you turn this around, of course, you could say, is the Israeli state a terrorist group? Well, if you're living in Gaza, you might think so. So the bottom line is, it depends on your point of view, who's the villain and who's the villain. Okay? That depends on, you know, what your beliefs are. One of the things about terrorism, it's a negative term. It's a pejorative term. When someone's labeled a terrorist, it's never a positive thing. So, you know, we have to look at it from that angle. That's why we see neutral nomenclature being used sometimes, such as extremist or rebel, or, you know, just things that don't imply violence, because terrorism does imply violence. And terrorist groups don't like being labeled as terrorists. And when I say terrorist groups, you know, that could be extremist groups, people that use violence to get a point across. And unfortunately, we live in a world where that takes place in almost every country. Sometimes terrorists try to legitimize their act by basically framing them in a military context, that this is their form of warfare. And this is very important, because what terrorism is, it is a form of warfare. And it's a form of warfare that's asymmetrical, which means that both sides do not have the same power. There's an asymmetry to it. So the terrorist group is a small group fighting a bigger group or fighting a country, and the other country has, you know, all the weapons and ammunition. And so what do terrorist groups do? They have to find a way to, you know, make themselves bigger than they actually are. And so we call this a force multiplier. They find a force multiplier. So an example of that might be a suicide bomber. Okay? This is one person, someone called him the poor man's B-52, a suicide bomber. But the bottom line is, there's no way to stop a suicide bomber. And we don't see that in the United States. I mean, think about, you know, if you wanted a suicide bomber, you know, the United States would be such an easy place because of all the soft targets. You know, malls and trains and buses and, you know, just people at concerts and stuff. But we don't see that. But, you know, we see it in other countries. The first suicide bombers in, you know, from a terrorist perspective, took place in Lebanon in the 1980s. And basically, we've seen it all over the world. And we have female suicide bombers, we have male suicide bombers, we have children suicide bombers. We have children that are sent out with a backpack, not knowing that it's a bomb. And they're told to go to this spot. And there's somebody that's going to, you know, activate the bomb when they get there. So they don't realize it, but they're, you know, kind of the tool of getting that suicide bomb to its location. Everybody knows about 9/11, and one of the mistakes that people do is they compare it to Pearl Harbor. Everybody's heard of Pearl Harbor, right? Okay. That was the biggest loss of life in American military action. Was 3,000 people, you know, were killed there. So people say, well, it's equivalent to 9/11, but that really wasn't a military action. It was more a dramatic terrorist act. It was trying to send a signal. It wasn't any type of starting a war or anything like that. It was targeting America. Where do you target America? At the center of its finance, capital, which is in New York City. The first time we see this happening in 1920, there was a guy that was driving a horse and buggy on Wall Street. Everybody knows where Wall Street is in New York. And he parked the carriage with the horse in front of J.P. Morgan's bank, left it. It blew up, and it killed dozens of people. This was kind of like the first IED, except it was on a horse and buggy, but it was that same concept. But 9/11, before 9/11, that was kind of the worst terrorist attack against America. Oklahoma would be much worse than, but from an outside actor. Nobody was ever arrested for the Wall Street bombing. This was when the World Trade Center was attacked. There was warnings that it was a target. It had been attacked in 1993. It had been bombed. Did you know that? In 1993, Ramzi Youssef had basically rented a van, put it in a spot underneath one of the towers with the anticipation that it would knock out the structure. And we know those towers do fall. And he was hoping that the explosion would knock that tower onto the other one like a domino effect and kill thousands of people. As a result, hundreds of people, thousands were probably injured. Not many people were killed, and he went to jail. And you know how he got caught? He went to the place where he had rented the van to get his deposit back. Talking about a master terrorist, so it's like a master criminal. And so anyway, so he ended up on maximum confinement. His cell was near Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. So they called that Bombers Row. So they had several other bombers on there. I think Eric Rudolph might have been there. But this was in the 1990s when this took place. Now you would think that they would learn a lesson. Nah. So they still kept terrorism intelligence operations in the World Trade Center instead of moving it to someplace else. So, you have to wonder sometimes who's running the show when it comes to, we can blame Democrats or Republicans. In this case, it was Bush, but Clinton was before Bush. So, it never surprises me when something terrible like that happens in the United States or anywhere else. So, terrorism is intended to achieve some type of goal. Quite often it's to change the political government. Sometimes it is to, change the religion that's in charge of the government. And many of the terrorist groups, of course, are from the Middle East, and they're anti-Western. They're anti-West. I say the West, the United States, and Europe, and so forth. And they're against secular governments they see as corrupt. And so, we see a religious, ideological reason for doing that. And remember, Islamic terrorists aren't the only religious terrorists. I want to make that clear right away. We find them in all capacities. But, if we look at terrorism over the last 50 years, and we look at religious groups, Islamic terrorist groups have been at the top, of the food chain. And, they view secular governments as corrupt. And the interesting thing, without getting into it, is, looking at how women are treated, for instance, in a lot of these countries where they're forced to cover themselves, and, just cover themselves. And the bottom line is, this is something that if you were to go to these countries where you wouldn't see this, 50 years ago. It's a new thing. It's a reinterpretation of the Quran. It's a reinterpretation of Islam. It's not, if you look at, the typical dress of women in Iran or Pakistan or any other countries, where we see extremist Islam, if you look at it in the past, you would see very stylish clothing and everything else. But this is, been a big change. Anyway, I don't want to get off the subject too much because I know you don't want me to. We often hear about people afraid that the terrorist groups, they want to introduce Sharia law to America. Sharia law, that's the Islamic legal code that we find in the Quran. And, the Sharia law, on top of it seems very punitive in many ways. Looking at sexual mores, looking at, drugs and everything else. But in reality, there are certain things under Islamic law that, we can learn from. For instance, no one is executed under Islamic law on the word of just one witness. In America, someone can be executed on the word of one witness. And witness testimony, as we know, is not something you can really trust that well. You don't see adultery being charged that often in Islamic law because you need to have 4 witnesses for a case of adultery. And they all have to tell the same story, what they saw. And if one of them varies, the other 3 are punished. I know it seems wacky. Murder is not the worst crime you can commit under Islamic law. The worst crimes you commit are things like apostasy, leaving the religion, blasphemy, saying something bad about the religion or the religious leaders. But the bottom line is, when we look at victims of terrorism, they're usually innocent people that just happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. When I was over in Israel studying terrorism, Israel had a bombing at a nightclub. And it targeted, there was a suicide bomber, and all the people were lined outside, to go in and party and whatever. And the person was in there and killed a couple dozen young people. And they deliberately left that building as a kind of memorial. So, it's, the glass is all shattered and things like that, but you knew what happened there. But these were defenseless victims. Now, of course, if we reverse it, we can say what's going on in Gaza with all the bombing. If we look at all the bombing that's going on in a lot of Middle Eastern countries, we can say, the same thing, that, this is terroristic, bombing civilian centers. But, we're not here to make that judgment, because then we get into, well, why are they bombing it? Why does Hamas and Hezbollah hide their military goods among the civilians or whatever? Asymmetrical warfare. This is their tactics that they have to use. So what 9/11 did is it created a climate of fear in America. It was kind of like the pandemic. One of the nice things about the pandemic, at least for me, someone likes to fly a lot, no one was flying during the pandemic. It felt like they had my private jets wherever I was going, so it really didn't bother me that much. But I think about it, how little we knew. I remember the first time I got on the plane, I was wearing gloves, and I'm thinking, what an idiot I must have looked like, in retrospect, and I'm spraying this and spraying that, got my hazmat suit on and all of that, no one knew what the hell was going on. And I never got sick with all the flying. But after 9/11, it's the same thing. Hardly anybody was flying for a while. They were all afraid of the planes being taken over, and they hadn't hardened the targets, which are usually where the pilots are in the front and that sort of thing. But creating a climate of fear is most important, because what that does, it really hurts the economic structure of a country. It hurts, trade, it hurts business, it hurts everything related to the operation of the country. So billions and billions of dollars, are lost every time there's been a major attack. So indiscriminate violence, I think, is a good way to look at it. So as I mentioned, some states, some countries perpetrate terrorism against its people. They might use it against people that are protesting. For instance, in Iran, a woman was killed in police custody, and there were big demonstrations and everything. And they started capturing people and torturing them and, basically going after the dissent, by suppressing it violently like that. That's one way to do that. You want to intimidate the population. You don't want the population to, basically think that it can get away with protesting against the government. So the government uses terrorism. So let's look at some words that are used to describe state-sponsored terrorism. Sometimes it's called authorized terror. It's being authorized by the state. It's legitimized by the state. It's sometimes called repressive terror. Sometimes called enforcement terror. And all of these pretty much represent the same phenomenon: authorized, repressive, enforcement, state-sponsored terrorism. In the 1970s in Latin America, we had lots of terrorist groups. We had lots of military dictatorships in the 1970s. And the military dictatorships waged war against its own citizens. In Argentina in the 1970s. One of the ways that they, one of the reasons they used for going after the citizens was saying that, they were supporting communism. And, any place in our hemisphere where communism is spreading, you're going to find the CIA at work. And the CIA was involved in teaching a lot of the death squads how to go after people that were dissidents. They would take people that were leaders of these dissident movements out over the Atlantic Ocean in a helicopter and just drop them out in there. And, that guy's not going to protest anymore. A lot of children were stolen from, families where they killed the man and imprisoned the woman. I mean, this dirty war in Argentina was I guess at its time was, considered one of the worst examples of state-sponsored terrorism. Let's just look at, looking at targets. The majority of targets when it comes to terrorism, the majority of victims are private citizens and their property. Then we would have law enforcement, general government, business, military, religious, educational, and so forth. Obviously, this changes from time to time, but these are where we see targets, and we know that there's lots of targets. Tourism is a frequent target. I mean, there's a lot of countries that depend on tourism, and one way to really hurt a country economically is to target the tourists. In Egypt, for instance, a lot of people go over there and see the pyramids and things like that. There's been terrorist attacks against groups of people visiting the pyramids and visiting others. And, obviously you see these people being hacked to death. On a tourist trip, it's not going to exactly be a great sales pitch for your travel agent, for you to go on a trip there. When I first started doing a study abroad, in fact, they weren't worried about Islamic terrorists. They were worried about the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, because the IRA would plant bombs on railroad tracks in London and places like that. One of the things you'll notice if you're ever in the London subway system is there's hardly any garbage cans, any places to dump garbage, because these are great places to place explosives, to hide explosives. And so sometimes when you see a lack of that, that's the reason for it, when you see a lack of garbage cans. So sometimes people say that guerrilla warfare is the same as terrorism. Everybody knows what guerrilla warfare is, right? Okay. It's another type of asymmetrical warfare. Used to be you had two armies of equal strength that met each other, but it's not like that anymore on the battlefield. But there are differences, and we do have terrorist groups that use guerrilla warfare, but it's not the same. The word guerrilla means little war, and it originated under Napoleon in Spain. So we see in the late 1700s, we see guerrilla warfare being talked about for the first time. And so we see them using terrorist tactics in military campaigns. and then the government uses its forces. Um, they use terrorism as well to deprive guerrillas of support, because the only way guerrilla movements are able to operate is if they have support on the ground from local communities and that sort of thing. If you look at Vietnam during the Vietnam War, you had the Viet Cong, you had the Vietnamese Army, and you had some of these little towns where they supported the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong. They were viewed as terrorists. And of course, the Americans would come and burn down these places. But it's very important that they have support, that guerrilla groups have support. But it gets to the point sometimes when people are being killed, people being targeted to such an extent, that the guerrillas lose their support. We just want things peaceful. We're willing to live under a dictatorship. So please, Mr. Terrorist, would you move somewhere else? So this is what it comes down to sometimes. So again, these are the two terms I want you to remember: asymmetrical warfare, and then using types of weapons that become force multipliers. A chemical weapon, a biological weapon. Just think that you're a small group, but you have biological or nuclear weapons or whatever. This would be a force multiplier against the other side. And of course, suicide bombing is one of the chief examples of a force multiplier. So again, as I mentioned, the earliest examples of terrorism we can find in ancient Israel. They were known as the Sicarii. They were known as the dagger men, and they would kill with a dagger. Now, the thing is, with terrorism, it's very important for it to be publicized, a terrorist act. So it's very easy to do that today because we're a land full of social media and TikTok. So everybody knows kind of something about what's going on. But back before mass media and all of that, how would you get the point across? Well, you would kill somebody, a leader, in a very public spot, so that everybody knew about it and the word got out. You might do it on a holiday, a high holiday or something, but the dagger was used by the zealots. Then you had the assassins, again, as I mentioned, and they were a radical Shiite Islamic sect. Who were the Shiites? Anybody know the difference between a Shiite and a Sunni? Well, these are your two major pathways of Islam, and Sunnis are the majority. So, like, if you want to find the most powerful Sunni country in the Middle East, it would be Saudi Arabia. Okay, Shiite is the smaller sect, and Iran would be that. Would be a good example of Shiite state, the most powerful Shiite state. And that's why they're always at loggerheads with each other, Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the main difference is basically when Muhammad died, they had to determine who should be in charge of Islam. And so the majority said that it should be decided within the faith by leaders and religious holy men, whereas others said it should be the cousin Ali, relatives of Ali, that should be the leaders, and they become the Shiites. So this is what the killing of each other is over. Who is the rightful heir to, the Islamic way of life? And so again, Sunnis are the majority. Anybody know what is the largest Islamic country in the world? Indonesia. Somehow they always get lost in the equation because they're all the way out in the Indian Ocean, way out there. But that's the largest population of Muslim people in the world. I mentioned French Revolution is where we first hear the word terrorism being used. Most terrorism occurs outside the United States. fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it. If we look at nowadays, most of the terrorist attacks in America are by anti-government Americans and white nationalists. I guess most of you were born when the Oklahoma City bombing took place, not in the mid-90s. We're in, anyway. I was around. But, when that took place, everybody said it had to be Arabs, had to be Muslims that did this, not realizing it was, kind of this Boy Scout looking guy, Timothy McVeigh, that did that. Has anybody been to Oklahoma City, to the memorial there at all? Interesting, they have a really good museum there. They actually have Timothy McVeigh's car in there. And here's another rocket scientist where he's getting away, and his license plate is hanging off the back of his car incorrectly. Police love to, pull people over for that. So he gets pulled over on his way to escaping. The guy has no idea this guy has just killed 268 people in Oklahoma City. But he pulls him over for that, and they find out before they let him out of jail that they've got, the guy who did it. The most terrorist attacks in America are by anti-government Americans. We hear of lone wolf attacks, a single perpetrator. This is a strategy that works very well. We see this with abortion clinic bombers, for instance. These are terrorist groups, like the Army of God, for instance. You have one person. You had an attack at the Olympics. Anybody know about the attack on the Olympics in 1996, where a bomb was set off in Atlanta, killed a number of people. This was set off by a guy named Eric Rudolph, and he was targeting not just the Olympics, but gay nightclubs. He was targeting abortion clinics and et cetera, et cetera. But he was a very successful, lone wolf terrorist. Looking at how frequent are terrorist attacks, these are numbers. To just go to 2017, and this is just in the United States, okay? However, does this mean that there were less terrorist attacks before 1994? And no, it just doesn't cover that period. But as I said, in the 1960s, most terrorist attacks were by extremist left-wing groups. And I'm talking about thousands of bombings in the 60s, thousands in the United States. The big difference was typically there wasn't any type of carnage. It was usually that someone would call ahead of time that there's a bomb here. We can look at the Unabomber as a terrorist, as well as a serial killer, as well as a serial bomber. But here we see in 9/11, not much change, but then we see it declining and staying pretty low. But there really isn't much as far as terrorism. A lot of times you don't even know that a terrorist attack took place. For instance, you see an SUV parking lot at a dealership, a car dealership, and all the cars are on fire. Well, most people would say, well, that was just, an accident. When in reality, it could be environmental terrorists that are targeting this place by lighting them on fire. They don't make a big deal about what they do. You have a new ski resort that opens up in Colorado in a pristine area, and it burns down all of a sudden. That could be a terrorist attack as well. So arson is used by environmental terrorists, by animal rights terrorist groups. We don't think about them, but animal rights and environmental terrorists commit a lot of the terrorist acts in the United States. They just typically don't kill anybody, although they could. What they'll do sometimes is put metal spikes in trees that are being logged in forests, so that when the trees are being knocked down, that the spikes fly out and can kill somebody. So there's always that possibility. It's the same thing with arson. Arson can be deadly. Anyway, I think I got the point across on all of that. I don't think this will come as any surprise. How frequent are terrorist attacks? Obviously, the Middle East, North Africa. North Africa is pretty much an extension of the Middle East. South Asia, South America. You don't see them in Australia or in New Zealand. And it kind of shifts from time to time, depending on who's in power. Okay, let's look at some different types of terrorism. Criminal terrorism. Typically, the questions on the next test come from this series of information I'm giving you here. The types, being able to recognize the types. Criminal terrorism is done to achieve an illicit goal or protect an illegal operation. Anybody think of an example of that? Anybody ever hear of like Pablo Escobar, the drug cartels? They use terrorism as a way of getting back at the government. What's that? The planes? Yeah, yeah. I mean, so drug cartels have used terrorism quite a bit. They use it more and more. I mean, what gets your attention more than having your relative in body parts dumped on your front lawn? That would catch your attention, wouldn't you? When that terrorized the hell out of you. But they're, they have their, they want to have the government scared. They want to have the people scared. Sometimes the governments will do the same thing, though, to suppress the people, to scare the people. So fear is very important. But when we look at criminal terrorism, we're talking about like Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. We're talking about the drug cartels and groups like that. The mafia, for instance, in Sicily, when they were being targeted by the government in Rome, they decided to set bombs up at different tourist sites in Italy back in the 1980s and 90s. And Italy's main tourism is one of its main economic, economic areas. And so they would put it outside art museums and things like that, bombs. So criminal organizations use terrorism. Then we have pathological terrorism. And this is done by someone with mental illness. People with mental illness are great recruits for terrorist groups too. People that have no problem using violence. The Unabomber would be something like that. He was mentally ill. So that would be an example of someone who was a pathological terrorist. Then we have political terrorism. When we're talking about political terrorism, we're talking about, the state or the regime. So basically, we have terrorism by non-governmental groups that are below the state. These are called sub-state political terrorists. We have state-sponsored, state-supported terrorism, where the government assists in the terrorism. Everybody's heard of apartheid, for instance, in South Africa, right? How many people have never heard of apartheid? Well, before 1994, it was extreme. South Africa was extremely segregated, the most segregated area probably on earth, and so you had terrorist groups. You might have heard of a guy named Nelson Mandela, who's kind of considered like kind of the George Washington of South Africa, but he was in charge of the African National Congress, the ANC, and he was involved in some of these bombing campaigns, and he was sentenced to prison for many, many years. During the 1980s and 90s, rock groups and so forth, they would never go and perform in South Africa, or they would be penalized in the United States. But until 1994, The South African government used terrorism against anybody that was an opponent of apartheid. In 1994, of course, this ended. So in South Africa, we see state-sponsored terrorism. So regime or state terrorism actions used to intimidate dissent in Argentina, South Africa. Do they teach you anything about the rest of the world in high school anymore? Or just Texas?
American history.
What's that?
Just American history.
Just American history. But everybody knows that there's a lot of stuff out there that they don't teach you anymore. It's really unfortunate, and I'm not going to get into all of that because I have a son that's your age, and just noticed that all they teach him was about Sam Houston and Davy Crockett and this and that. But it used to be in high school they taught you about geography, where all the countries were and the relationships and all these things. It's very important to understand what goes on. But any of the terrorist groups, terrorist violence going on around the world, it's not happening in a vacuum. There's something that stimulates it. Whether I'm in China, what's going on in China. Have you heard of the Uyghurs? The Uyghurs are one of the main minority groups in China that is Islamic and Muslim, and they are kept in concentration camps essentially in Western China. But it's far away, so we don't think about things like that. It's funny that my mom's always worrying when I leave the country to go someplace, like Beirut or whatever. And so, I don't know if you saw the story a few months ago, that 4 teachers were stabbed in China, American teachers. And it was just some nut job that, saw some Americans and, or saw some people that were Caucasian and just decided to stab them. So she's telling me that, she's worried that something's going to happen to me because I'm a teacher and I'm over in China. And I said, Mom, there's over 1 billion people out over there, the chances of me being stabbed are much more likely going down to Houston to the airport, than going to China. I mean, just stupid stuff like that, So I usually tell her I'm going to Roswell, New Mexico instead of Beirut or something like that. I used to teach in Roswell. They have the International Law Enforcement Academy, ILEA. It's located in Roswell, New Mexico. Can you imagine that you're a cop from Botswana or Namibia or Turkmenistan or any of these countries that you really don't hear that much about, and they're high-ranking police in their countries, and they're coming to be trained by the State Department in the United States, and they're sent to Roswell, New Mexico. Anybody in here ever been to Roswell? Okay, there's not much going on there, just a bunch of fake UFOs. Yeah, so what was funny, what they would do is try and find stuff for the cops to do at night. There usually be like 30 or 40 of them there from around the world. And there was this one, did you go to the store where they sell all of the souvenirs, the Roswell souvenirs and stuff? Well, they have a research facility there too, where they show a alien autopsy going on. And so I'm just thinking, I'm looking at these guys, coming from, Central Asia and from Africa, and Latin America, and you're walking along and watching the alien. I'm thinking, what the hell are they thinking? That goes on here. Yeah. Well, the only person I've ever heard from there is Demi Moore, came from Roswell, and I think the reason they have it in Roswell is because no one, the security is really tight. It's hard for someone to be a spy from these countries and get anything done unless they're looking for sagebrush or something like that. The Roswell was a really tricky place, and a lot of these cops would come from countries where prostitution is legal. As you know, in America, it's only legal in one spot. And so there's a Best Western where they all stayed at, and so the local prostitutes would all go there, and there are always these sting operations going on. And some of these cops are being arrested, you know, from Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan or whatever, and kicked out, sent home to be executed or whatever. It's just always weird stuff going on there. It's pretty entertaining, but very misogynistic police in those countries as well. I'll see a couple pictures from my trip.